The knock wasn't polite. It was the kind of pounding that rattled the screen door, shook the wooden frame, and jolted me out of the Sunday paper and halfway out of my skin. I'd barely taken a sip of my second cupful of coffee. The sun was still climbing above the pine trees out back, casting long shadows across our porch. Peaceful, until that knock. I set the mug down on the railing and stepped towards the door. More pounding. James Rollins, open the door, HOA enforcement, HOA enforcement. I frowned and looked through the peephole. 5 men in black tactical vests stood clustered at the bottom of our front steps. The vests bore big white letters, HOA Police. Evan Carter had a clipboard. Miles Brooks had what looked like zip ties hooked to his belt. Victor Hayes, a tall guy with slicked back hair and mirrored sunglasses, had his hand resting on something that suspiciously resembled a baton. James Rollins. This is your final warning, Victor Hayes barked. Open the door or we'll escalate. Escalate. On what grounds? I stepped back, slowly, heart beginning to tick faster. I wasn't afraid, just calculating. I'd been through worse, but this was new. They didn't have badges, not real ones, not the kind I recognized from my years in the Marines or from watching my wife work cases from the bench. These weren't cops. They were actors playing dress-up bullies with a clipboard and matching shirts, and they picked the wrong porch. I opened the inner door and unlocked the storm door, keeping the glass between us. State your business, I said flatly. Evan Carter stepped forward, shoving a paper against the glass. You are in violation of Greenwood Hills HOA Ordinance 14.7-B. Unauthorized modifications to your front railing and planting unapproved shrubs along the eastern perimeter. We are here to enforce compliance and initiate property inspection. I raised an eyebrow. By storming my porch on a Sunday morning, you were warned twice by mail, he snapped. Failure to respond has led us to this stage. Mail? I snorted. You mean the glossy flyer with no return address and a logo that looks like it was printed at Kinko's? They shifted. I folded my arms. Where's your legal authority? You have a warrant. We don't need a warrant, said Victor Hayes. This is HOA jurisdiction. You signed the bylaws when you bought the home. No, I said calmly. I signed a closing document acknowledging there's an HOA. I didn't sign away my constitutional rights. Miles Brooks snorted, but his eyes darted nervously toward the street. There were no sirens, no police cruisers, just 5 guys standing on a porch with puffed chests and matching outfits. I opened the glass door an inch, just enough for my voice to land sharper. You have 5 seconds to step off my property before this becomes criminal trespass. Evan Carter stiffened. You're escalating this. No, gentlemen, I said. You escalated when you came onto my property with fake uniforms and threats. Just then, the screen door creaked behind me. My wife stepped out. Bathrobe. Calm expression. No makeup. She looked like any woman might on a quiet Sunday morning until you saw the eyes. Those eyes had sentenced bank CEOs, sent cartel runners to federal prison, and made constitutional law sound like poetry in a courtroom. She surveyed the scene. Victor Hayes, Evan Carter, Miles Brooks, Carl Reed, and Nathan Wells in tactical vests. Clipboard shaking, mirrored sunglasses twitching. She said nothing at first, just stepped beside me and looked out at the officers. What's going on? She asked softly. Victor Hayes perked up, mistaking her calm tone for submission. Ma'am, we're enforcing HOA compliance orders. Your husband is obstructing an inspection. Will be forced to enter the property if Judge Caroline Rollins raised her hand. Just one hand. And the porch went silent. Sir, she said to Evan Carter, do you have a warrant signed by a state or federal judge? He blinked. This paper, he stammered, is a Greenwood Hills HOA authorized enforcement order. That's not what I asked, she interrupted gently. Do you have a legal warrant issued by a court of law granting you permission to enter private property? Evan Carter hesitated. No, but we're permitted under the HOA code to... My name is Judge Caroline Rollins, she said. I am a sitting United States federal judge, and what you're attempting is a violation of state trespass laws, potential impersonation of law enforcement under Title 18, and interference with civil liberties protected under the Constitution. Nathan Wells actually took a step back. Miles Brooks's face turned pale. "You have 10 seconds," she said quietly, "to get off my porch before I call the U.S. Marshal Service and have every one of you held for impersonation and intimidation." Nobody moved. Then she added 9. They broke, like leaves in the wind. No yelling, no defense. Just fast steps backward, a tripping foot on the first step, and a mumbled curse from Evan Carter as he dropped the so-called enforcement order. It fluttered across the lawn like the worthless prop it was. I bent down, picked it up, and glanced at the bottom. No court seal, no signature, no legal letterhead, just a rubber stamp and a printed name, Acting Director of Compliance, GHOA Patrol Division. I laughed. Caroline turned back toward the house like it was any other morning. But it wasn't. Because now this wasn't just a case of HOA harassment. It was something bigger. It was an operation. And someone thought they could bluff their way into our home with fake threats costumes and bureaucracy. They didn't just pick the wrong porch, they picked the wrong judge's porch. By noon that day, the footage from our porch cam had already been downloaded, backed up, and sent to 3 different locations. I wasn't taking chances. Not after the last time I saw people in tactical gear try to assert authority without any real backing. That time had ended in someone getting hurt. I didn't plan on history repeating itself on my doorstep. Caroline disappeared into her home office, already drafting a formal statement of events, and I sat at the kitchen table with the enforcement order spread in front of me. It was laughably bad. No legal formatting, no seal, no reference to municipal or county ordinance. Just HOA jargon layered with vague threats. Failure to comply may result in escalated action, including fines, legal proceedings, or physical intervention. Physical intervention. That line alone could bury them. I poured another coffee and sat down to read the fine print again. The names listed as signatories were all familiar. At least 2 of them I recognized as the self-appointed compliance officers who walked around Greenwood Hills with clipboards and scowls. Ever since the new HOA president, Janet Cole, took over, things had changed in our quiet cul-de-sac. Janet was a former corporate HR manager with a love for bylaws and a gift for intimidation wrapped in passive-aggressive smiles. She'd only lived in the neighborhood 2 years, but once she got voted onto the board, she started treating it like she was running a private militia. The HOA police nonsense, that was her idea. Their uniforms, custom ordered. The SUV with the blue and white decal that read, "Neighborhood Enforcement," registered under a shell company she founded for security oversight. Most neighbors grumbled but went along. Some ignored it. But others, they feared it. Especially the elderly folks on fixed incomes, the single parents who didn't want trouble, and the immigrants who didn't want to be on anyone's radar. I'd kept my distance, paid my dues, trimmed my hedges, never made waves. But now the waves had come crashing to my front steps, and they came armed with clipboards and entitlement. An hour after their little retreat, a white sedan pulled up in front of my driveway. I didn't recognize it at first, but the woman who stepped out was unmistakable. Janet Cole. Hair tight in a bun. Beige blazer. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't walk. She marched, right up the front walkway like she owned it. This time I met her on the porch. "James Rollins," she began with syrupy stiffness. "I'd like to speak with you about this morning's incident." "Incident," I repeated. "I'm afraid your behavior was obstructive and in violation of cooperative agreement terms under Section 5A. I held up the crumpled document. "This nonsense," her lips tightened. "That's an official order." "No, it's a Word document with buzzwords," she flushed. "We've implemented new enforcement protocols to ensure compliance. Our officers are trained." "They're not officers," I cut in. "They're neighbors in matching shirts. And what you attempted this morning was not enforcement. It was trespassing." Janet's nostrils flared. "James Rollins, I'm warning you. Non-cooperation can and will lead to fines. Possibly liens against your property. You want to go that route?" I said calmly. "Then let's talk about impersonating law enforcement, or falsifying legal documents, or attempting forced entry under the color of authority." She took a half step back, and I noticed the faint flicker in her eyes, the first crack in her facade. I've contacted the county attorney, I said, letting the words hang in the air. And by tomorrow morning, your little HOA police stunt will be in their inbox, complete with body cam footage, security cam angle, and a statement from a sitting federal judge. Janet opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. And I'll be filing a restraining order against you personally. That one landed. She took a long breath, steadying herself. You don't want to escalate this, James Rollins. I stepped down the porch stairs and walked right up to her. You escalated it when you sent a bunch of costumed cowboys to threaten my wife in her bathrobe. You just didn't know who she was. She narrowed her eyes. You think just because she's a judge, I think because she's a judge, she knows exactly how to dismantle this circus, legally and efficiently. Silence. Birds chirped overhead. The wind rustled the maple tree. Janet tapped something on her phone. You'll be hearing from our legal counsel. I'm counting on it, I said, and went back inside. That evening, we sat at the dinner table in silence for a few minutes until Caroline finally spoke. They'll come back, she said softly, dabbing her napkin. I know. They're desperate. I know. She sipped her tea. Then let's make sure the next time they knock, it's with real police here to serve them. I nodded, already making calls, and I was. Because this wasn't just a petty HOA scuffle anymore. This was intimidation, abuse of power, and impersonation of authority. And now that I knew the depths of it, I had no intention of letting it slide. They'd knocked on the wrong porch. They'd tried to scare the wrong woman. And they had no idea what was coming next. The morning after Janet's visit, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had been thin, my mind cycling through scenarios like a tactical briefing. What if they came back with more people? What if they had some poor deputy fooled into thinking their made-up authority was real? What if they pushed it far enough to warrant legal escalation? Caroline, of course, had been her usual unshaken self. She spent most of the night in her office reading over the Greenwood Hills HOA charter, printing out every public ordinance the neighborhood fell under, and compiling a timeline of the entire encounter. I could hear her typing long after midnight. Her calm was unnerving only because I knew what it meant she was preparing for battle. By 9:30 a.m., we were both dressed and waiting. She sat at the breakfast nook reading briefs from her circuit. I stood by the window, half coffee, half tension. When the dark SUV turned onto our street again, I felt my stomach knot. Same decals, same posture of self-importance, different driver. Victor Hayes, Carl Reed, and Nathan Wells stepped out this time. Wearing sunglasses and those ridiculous HOA enforcement jackets again, black windbreakers with bold white letters like they were about to serve warrants on a crime syndicate. They didn't bother knocking this time. Carl Reed walked up to the porch and pounded on the screen door like a landlord on rent day. I moved toward the door, already flicking on the security camera, with a remote in my pocket. "We're here to complete yesterday's compliance check," Carl Reed barked. "You're not authorized," I said through the glass. "We have a mandate," he said, and held up a folder like it meant something. "Failure to comply will result in citation and possible referral to community court." "There's no such thing as community court," I replied. Sir Nathan Wells chimed in, "This is your final warning." I didn't move. Then I felt a presence beside me. Caroline. In a crisp navy pantsuit, hair pulled back, subtle earrings, heels quiet but firm on the hardwood floor. Her presence filled the room like a judge entering chambers. The same air, the same silence. She reached forward and unlocked the door with a deliberate click. I froze. Then she opened it. Gentle breeze. No words yet. Victor Hayes, Carl Reed, and Nathan Wells straightened slightly. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the badge Real Federal hanging from a leather wallet in her left hand. Or maybe it was the way she looked directly into Victor Hayes' eyes and said, "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave this property before I notify the U.S. Marshals." No shouting, no escalation, just a statement of fact. The men blinked. "We're enforcing HOA regulations," Victor Hayes said, voice lower now. "You are trespassing," Caroline said, enunciating each syllable with surgical clarity. "And impersonating law enforcement. I have you on video from yesterday today, and likely more to come. The documents you're holding carry no legal weight under our county charter. And if you attempt to cross this threshold, I will personally file a federal injunction and contact the Attorney General's office for abuse of municipal rights. Silence. Carl Reed finally asked, Who exactly are you? She smiled, but it wasn't warm. I'm Judge Caroline Rollins, Federal Circuit Court District 7, and you just stepped into a world you do not understand. Carl Reed blinked. This isn't necessary. Agreed, she said, still holding the door. You have 20 seconds. They backed away. No words, no protests, no threats this time. Just turned around and walked almost too quickly back to their vehicle, climbed in, and left the street like they had something urgent to forget. Caroline stepped back inside and locked the door. She didn't look at me right away, just moved toward the kitchen. What's for breakfast? She asked, calm as a lake. I stared for a beat, stunned. You just made 3 fake cops retreat like kids caught shoplifting. They weren't ready for anyone to speak fluent statute, she said, pulling a pan from the rack. And I'm hungry. I finally laughed. You're terrifying. I'm focused, she replied, cracking an egg into the pan. And I've already emailed our footage to Judge Samuel Whitman, Sheriff Thomas Dunlap, and the Regional Ethics Committee. We're filing injunctions this week. I poured her coffee. She raised the mug in silent thanks, then added, They'll come again. But not for long. And somehow I believed her. We weren't just defending a porch anymore. We were laying the groundwork for a reckoning. The silence that followed Caroline's declaration hung heavier than any threat those men could have made. I stood at the doorway, still gripping the inner handle, while Caroline, my wife of 23 years, my best friend, and as of that moment, the unflinching embodiment of federal authority, remained calm and poised just a few feet ahead of me. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't flinched, she hadn't even blinked. Victor Hayes, Evan Carter, and Miles Brooks, still arrayed on our porch in black windbreakers and heavy boots, shifted uneasily. Victor Hayes looked down at the badge Caroline held aloft in her left hand, squinting at it as if trying to wish it into something fake. This is your final warning, Caroline said again, her tone clipped but steady. Leave our property, immediately, or I'll initiate formal legal action under Title 18, Section 912 of the U.S. Code impersonation of a federal officer. And that's just the start. Victor Hayes' confidence, already eroded, broke entirely when she added, I also serve as a supervising magistrate. If you doubt me, you can call the district clerk. Ask for Judge Rollins. I saw it then, a single bead of sweat at his temple. He looked over his shoulder at Evan Carter and Miles Brooks. Miles Brooks was already stepping back, unsure whether to speak or run. Evan Carter mumbled something into a walkie-talkie clipped to his vest. Static. No answer. You're bluffing, Victor. Hayes tried, but his voice cracked. Caroline took a slow step forward. Would you like me to call the U.S. Marshal's office and have them explain it to you? That broke them. They turned. Fast. No bluster. No orders. Just boots scraping the wooden porch, hands fumbling with gear, a retreat that looked less like strategy and more like shame. I couldn't believe it. These guys had shown up 30 minutes ago like they owned the street. Now they were scattering like raccoons caught in a garage light. Caroline turned to me calmly. Close the door, will you, sweetheart? I did, locking it behind them with a satisfying click. We stood in the foyer for a moment, watching their SUV pull away through the side window. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Caroline was already heading back toward her study. I followed her. You didn't even hesitate. She was powering up her laptop. Why would I? They could have, I don't know, tried something. She gave me a look, half affection, half razor blade. The most dangerous man in that group was the one who believed his own lie. You just have to know how to cut through it. She opened a document. I glanced over. It was a formal notification to the DOJ's Public Integrity section. You're filing already. I'm not prosecuting, she reminded me, but I am obligated to report impersonation of law enforcement, especially in a residential jurisdiction. This isn't just harassment. It's a federal crime. I sat down across from her. They're going to come back. Yes, she said simply. But next time, they'll find we're not the only ones watching. She reached for her phone and tapped the speaker button. Hello, this is Judge Rollins, she said once the line picked up. I'd like to speak with Director Elizabeth Harding in Federal Court Security. It's urgent. I need a threat assessment filed for impersonation incidents involving unregulated HOA entities. There was a pause. Then she smiled slightly. Thank you. I'll hold. I leaned back in the chair and stared at her like I was seeing her for the first time, not just my wife, not just a judge, but a fortress. And in that moment, I knew the people who thought they could intimidate us had no idea what they'd started. 3 days passed, and while our porch stayed quiet, the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. Neighbors began calling hesitant at first, then more urgently. I'd never heard Linda Morales cry before the kind of tough-as-nails former nurse who once stitched up a neighbor's dog after a lawnmower accident without batting an eye. But that afternoon, she trembled on the phone. They barged into my backyard last month, she whispered. Claimed I had an unauthorized shed. Said they'd fine me $500 a day if I didn't let them inside the garage. Then came Marvin Ochoa, the retired firefighter down the block. They cornered my wife at the mailbox. He told me, voice shaking with fury. Told her we had violated perimeter uniformity standards because I painted the trim myself. What the hell does that even mean, story after story? They'd all been hit, different times, same tactics, black vests with HOA enforcement in bold white letters. Laminated IDs clipped to their collars, complete with a Greenwood Hills HOA logo, and a barcode no scanner could read. Threats of fines, demands for entry. Legalese rattled off with just enough confidence to scare someone into submission. And every single time, not a shred of actual authority. Caroline listened quietly to each caller, taking notes in her legal pad, the way she did on the bench, precise, calm, total focus. I want affidavits, she told me that evening as we sat down at our kitchen table. Personal statements dated and signed. If they'll write what happened and allow me to submit it to the district ethics office, I can file a preliminary notice. What exactly are we dealing with here? I asked. Is this just bullying? Intimidation? She shook her head. It's more sophisticated than that. Someone within the Greenwood Hills HOA leadership or someone who's weaponized them has created a shadow operation. They're not enforcing real codes. They're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can go before someone pushes back. Well, I said someone just did. She gave me a half smile. Yes, but they didn't expect the judge's wife to be a judge. We spent the next day gathering documents. I helped install security cameras for 3 of our neighbors who felt unsafe. Caroline reviewed the HOA's charter, which shockingly made no mention of an enforcement division. No authority for door-to-door inspections. No budgetary allocation for uniforms or equipment. We also learned that this enforcement unit hadn't just popped up overnight. They'd been operating for over a year, slowly increasing their presence, showing up in the evenings, issuing pseudo-citations. The Greenwood Hills HOA board, when pressed, claimed it was an experimental compliance initiative. But no one remembered voting on it. No one remembered it being introduced in an open meeting. Until one late afternoon, when I got a knock on the door. It wasn't the fake police. It was Sarah Chen, the youngest member of the HOA board, mid-30s, shy, and rarely seen outside of budget reviews. She looked nervous, clutching a folder to her chest. "Can I speak with your wife?" she asked. "Sure," I said. "She's just—" But Caroline had already appeared behind me. Sarah looked relieved. I can't stay long. I just wanted to say I didn't approve any of this. Neither did the treasurer or the communications chair. Then, who did Caroline ask gently? Sarah looked down. George Hammond. And a guy named Vic Tran. They said it was all cleared, that the board had a legal advisor, that we had liability protection. Caroline stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, Sarah handed over the folder. Inside were emails, invoices, uniform orders, even a draft field manual for the HOA Enforcement Task Force. But what caught Caroline's eye was the final document, a drafted memo to the board, suggesting a plan to begin fee-based corrective enforcement, essentially fines in exchange for intimidation carried out by non-licensed personnel under the illusion of HOA authority. "This isn't just impersonation," Caroline said, her voice low. "It's extortion." Sarah nodded, eyes wide. "I didn't know where else to go, but you scared them. And people are starting to talk." After Sarah left, Caroline turned to me, her face a mask of resolve. "They've been using fear as currency," she said. "Now it's time we devalue it." That night, the kitchen became our war room. Caroline's legal pad, once just scribbled notes from neighbors, had evolved into a case outline worthy of a federal brief. She pinned timelines, cross-referenced names, even printed out screen captures from the doorbell footage across Greenwood Hills. The walls filled up fast. If you didn't know better, you'd think we were FBI agents building a RICO case. But Caroline wasn't interested in just local slap-on-the-wrist justice. She wanted real accountability. "There are 3 legal pillars we can stand on," she said, tapping her pen like a gavel. "Impersonating law enforcement, wire fraud, since they used HOA emails to send false directives, and civil intimidation under color of authority." "Color of authority?" I asked. She nodded. "It means they pretended to be something they're not and used that false power to threaten or manipulate others. In many cases, it carries harsher penalties than actual assault." "And you can't try the case yourself," I said. "Correct. I'm conflicted out," she replied. "But I can submit a judicial ethics referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district. That gets the ball rolling. Do we have enough?" Caroline glanced at the folder Sarah had left behind, plus the new affidavits that poured in that day, 12 statements and counting. "We're past enough," she said. "We have a pattern, a paper trail, and victims willing to testify." Still, I could see the hesitation in her. This was her neighborhood too. She'd wanted peace and privacy. After years of ruling on cartel cases, political indictments, and corporate fraud, now she was being dragged back in not from ambition, but from duty. And that made me love her more. By the end of the week, she'd compiled everything into a sealed packet marked Confidential Federal Referral and handed it directly to Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Foster during a quiet meeting downtown. He recognized her immediately. "You're sure this isn't retaliation?" he asked, flipping through the pages. "I'm sure," she said, "and I won't be involved beyond the submission. But you'll want to read page 47. He did, and paused, then let out a long, low whistle. "They created a fake municipal compliance order with a forged city seal. That's a federal offense." She simply nodded. The next morning, a letter went out from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the Greenwood Hills HOA Board. An official notification that an investigation into impersonation fraud and harassment had been initiated. It wasn't public yet, but word spread fast. George Hammond resigned for personal reasons the next day. Vic Tran disappeared from the community's WhatsApp group and stopped answering calls. No more HOA patrols walked the sidewalks. Greenwood Hills, once under quiet siege, felt like it exhaled for the first time in a year. But it wasn't over. One afternoon, Caroline got a call from Deputy Sophia Mendez. "Judge Rollins," she said, unusually formal, "I've been asked to assist in collecting final statements for the U.S. Attorney. They're pulling together a grand jury, Mike." Caroline met her at Sheriff Thomas Dunlap's office, not as a judge, not as a neighbor, but as a witness to what had unfolded on our porch. When she came back home, she said quietly, "They're going to call Marvin Ochoa, Linda Morales, and 3 others to testify. And you?" "I've recused myself from everything," she said. "But they'll use my footage and the statement Sarah Chen gave." I put my hand over hers. "Are you okay with that?" She looked toward the porch. "After what they did, after they walked up here and tried to act like gods with clipboards, yes, I am." And then for the first time in a long time, we sat on the porch together in silence. No patrols, no threats, no fear. Just the slow creak of the rocker, the scent of cut grass, and the quiet resolve of people who had finally turned fear into fire and fire into justice. The envelope arrived with no fanfare, just a plain white packet slipped into our mailbox on a Thursday morning bearing the seal of the U.S. District Court. Inside was a subpoena. Not for Caroline, of course. She had recused herself from any prosecutorial role the moment she submitted the referral, but for me. And for Linda Morales, Sarah Chen, and Clarence Bryant, who lived 2 streets over and hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to us before that day. Now, we were all witnesses. The grand jury convened behind closed doors in a gray-walled courthouse downtown. I sat in a sterile waiting room, with the others under flickering fluorescents thumbing the edge of my statement until they called my name. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Foster Young, sharp-suited and laser-focused, greeted me with a nod and led me into the chamber. 12 jurors, solemn and unreadable, sat in silence. They asked me to recount the day the fake HOA police stormed my porch, so I did. I told them about the vests, the fabricated ordnance Victor Hayes waved in my face the way Victor Hayes, Evan Carter, Miles Brooks, Carl Reed, and Nathan Wells spread out like a tactical team on my lawn, and the sharp, unblinking intensity of Victor Hayes, who claimed to be Sergeant Donnelly. I described their threats, their refusal to show credentials, their attempt to open my gate by force, and the exact moment Caroline stepped outside, calm as steel, and brought the entire act crashing down with just a sentence. They listened without expression. But when I mentioned Caroline flashing her federal ID, I caught the corner of one juror's mouth twitch into a smirk. Then came Linda Morales. Her voice cracked as she spoke about how the same group had come to her home 2 weeks prior, banging on her garage at 10 p.m. shouting about unauthorized plant height. They frightened her children. They threatened to fine her $5,000 unless she let them inspect her backyard. Clarence Bryant, stiff-backed and proud, described how Victor Hayes referred to himself as lieutenant and demanded to see proof of his veteran's disability exemption status. Clarence had served 3 tours overseas and was nearly blind in one eye. He told them to shove it. But the violation notice still showed up in his mailbox the next morning. We were done before noon. But it didn't feel over. That night, the local news ran a segment, Fake Police in Greenwood Hills, HOA Federal Jury Investigates Militia Tactics in Suburban Enforcement Scheme. The story had legs. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at the rumors now paid attention. A few knocked on our door with envelopes, letters they had received months ago that suddenly looked suspicious. Others emailed video clips from doorbell cams, or forwarded emails from HOA task force members that now seemed uncomfortably threatening. By week's end, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Foster had evidence spanning 15 months of escalating abuse. Greenwood Hills, HOA Board, minutes referencing community enforcement actions never approved by residents. Custom patches and badges ordered in bulk under a shell LLC. Doctored violation photos submitted to the county to justify liens. HOA funds mysteriously reallocated to untraceable consulting fees. Then came the big one. A voice recording surfaced an accidental voicemail left on a resident's phone, capturing a conversation between George Hammond and Vic Tran. If Judge Rollins keeps poking around, we might need to send her something more convincing. George Hammond's voice rasped. You've got friends at that contractor's office, don't you? Make a compliance order. Stamp it. Make it look official. That was the nail in the coffin. The U.S. Attorney moved quickly. Arrest warrants were issued for George Hammond, Vic Tran, Victor Hayes, and Carl Reed. Charges ranged from impersonation of law enforcement to conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation, under color of authority, and unlawful surveillance. Caroline, bound by her judicial ethics, didn't speak to the press, but I did. In front of a dozen cameras and microphones on our front lawn, I told the story not to embarrass Greenwood Hills, but to remind everyone watching that justice didn't only live in courtrooms. Sometimes it lived on porches, sometimes it wore a sundress and carried a federal badge. I ended the interview with this. If they'd knocked on the wrong door, if they'd frightened the wrong child or cornered the wrong widow, this could have ended differently. But my wife believed in the law more than their threats, and so do I. It aired that night, across 3 counties. But the part that mattered most didn't come from the news. It came the next morning when I opened the door to find Clarence Bryant standing for eyes moist, holding a folded American flag. He placed it in my hands. For your porch, he said. So they remember what it stands for. The courthouse buzzed like a hive the day of the preliminary hearing. It wasn't often that a local HOA scandal made it into federal court, but this wasn't just any HOA, and it wasn't just any courtroom. The gallery was packed residents, journalists, and even a few city officials filled the rows. The tension was heavy like the air before a thunderstorm. George Hammond, the former Greenwood Hills HOA president, walked in flanked by two attorneys. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His once imposing presence was diminished, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. Beside him were Victor Hayes, and Carl Reed, their uniforms traded for plain suits and quiet shame. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Foster began with opening remarks that sent murmurs through the room. He laid out a timeline, 15 months of coordinated intimidation, forged documents, abuse of power, and HOA dues rerouted into unauthorized security contracts. But it was the impersonation that truly lit the room. They wore tactical vests, they carried counterfeit badges, they introduced themselves as law enforcement. They threatened families under the illusion of legal authority. That is not just a neighborhood dispute. That is federal criminal behavior, Daniel Foster said, his voice echoing off the polished oak walls. Then came the evidence. The video of our porch confrontation played first. The sound of Caroline's calm voice declaring her status as a federal judge froze the entire courtroom. Gasps rippled as the video showed Victor Hayes, Evan Carter, and Miles Brooks backing away, stunned. Caroline sat beside me, unreadable as stone. Next came the voicemail, the one George Hammond left unintentionally. As the jury heard him discussing ways to make a compliance order look official, the silence turned to visible disgust. One juror shook her head. Judge Margaret Hayes raised an eyebrow. But the most damning blow came when they played footage from Linda Morales' doorbell camera. In the video, Vic Tran stepped forward in his fake uniform, barking accusations about fence height violations while holding what looked like a real citation pad. He threatened to fine her on the spot and used the phrase "under my authority" as HOA enforcement. Daniel Foster turned to Judge Margaret Hayes. "Your Honor, there is no such legal designation under this HOA's charter. This was not enforcement. This was a costume, a con." I watched George Hammond shrink further into his seat. Then, witnesses were called. Clarence Bryant walked to the stand, cane in hand. His military record was read into court before he testified. "They tried to make me feel like I owed them proof of my service," he said, voice gravelly with emotion. "I fought for this country. I don't answer to men in Halloween costumes with clipboards." The crowd applauded until Judge Margaret Hayes banged the gavel and reminded them this was still a court of law. But the message was clear. The tide had turned. One after another, residents stood up and testified stories of late-night visits, threatening letters, intimidation over garden gnomes, flags, and parked cars. Elderly women cried. Jake Torres talked about how he no longer played outside because he was afraid of the HOA cops. The horror wasn't in one moment, it was in the cumulative weight of a neighborhood made afraid of itself. The defense tried to paint George Hammond and his crew as overzealous but well-intentioned. They were simply filling a gap in enforcement, one attorney argued. There was no malice. But Judge Margaret Hayes didn't buy it. "Intentions don't excuse illegal impersonation, especially when it leads to harassment," she said. The preliminary hearing wrapped after 3 days. Judge Margaret Hayes ruled that there was ample evidence for a full trial and denied bail for George Hammond and Vic Tran, citing the risk of further intimidation or document tampering. Victor Hayes and Carl Reed were remanded into custody. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Caroline remained inside, refusing interviews. I spoke again briefly. "This isn't just about HOA rules," I said. "It's about power, who has it, and how far they're willing to go to keep it. They came to our homes pretending to be something they weren't. But this court reminded them, and all of us, what real authority looks like." That night, the front page of the paper ran the headline, "From HOA to DOJ, Greenwood Hills Power Play Faces Federal Reckoning," and underneath a photo of Caroline on the porch, hand resting on mine, no fear in her eyes. The tide was turning not just in court, but in the soul of Greenwood Hills. Within a week of the courtroom revelations, Greenwood Hills began to unravel everything the old HOA board had built and weaponized. It started with an emergency meeting called by the interim property manager, Derek Whitman, who had only taken the job 6 weeks earlier. He stood on a fold-out stage in the local community center, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. But what he said shook the room. As of this morning, 5 members of the Greenwood Hills HOA board, including former President George Hammond, have either resigned or been placed under federal investigation. Effective immediately, the current HOA charter is suspended pending review by the community. A stunned silence followed, then applause, slow, unsure at first, then roaring. For years, those of us living under that HOA had grown used to constant tension memos about mailbox paint colors, passive-aggressive warnings about lawn-length threats for leaving trash bins out past 600 p.m. But now that the facade had crumbled, people started talking, really talking, not in whispers at mailboxes, but in open forums on community message boards in packed town hall meetings where fear no longer stifled honesty. We learned about a slush fund. Nearly $82,000 of HOA dues had been funneled into security operations, a line item that no one could find in the official budget. Contracts signed with a fake enforcement training firm. Legal letters paid for in community funds, many of which had been used to silence residents who spoke out. Mrs. Elena Petrov stood trembling in the third meeting and said I was told if I kept putting out sunflowers in my yard, they'd fine me into foreclosure. I grew those flowers for my late husband. No one interrupted her. No one told her to sit down. Instead, Marvin Ochoa stood up and said, "Then next spring we all plant sunflowers." It felt like something had cracked open. A wound, yes, but also a flood of healing light. Behind the scenes, Caroline quietly helped the Greenwood Hills Residents Committee draft a new charter. She refused to chair it. "I'm not a resident lawyer," she said with a small smile, "just a wife who had enough." But the truth was, everyone looked to her now. Her name carried weight not because of her bench, but because of how calmly and powerfully she had stared down those who thought uniforms and fear could control a community. The new charter included protections for residents, rules about financial transparency, a complete ban on armed or uniformed neighborhood patrols, and a requirement that all board actions be made public within 48 hours. But most radical of all, it gave residents a path to vote on dissolving the HOA entirely, should future abuses ever occur again. That clause got the loudest applause. As the new charter was ratified, neighbors who had once been wary of each other began repairing the social fabric. Block parties returned. Gardens bloomed in defiance of outdated aesthetic conformity rules. Kids chalked messages on sidewalks again. But the most symbolic moment happened on a Sunday afternoon. Caroline and I brought out the old rocking chairs, the ones we'd had to move off our porch after a compliance warning. We put them back exactly where they used to be, facing the street, beside the rose bushes that had miraculously survived the years of tension. We sat. No police came. No clipboard warriors knocked. Only a few neighbors passed by, some waving, others pausing just to say thank you. "I forgot how quiet this could be," I said, reaching for her hand. Caroline smiled. "It's not just quiet, it's free." That night she received a letter, handwritten, from Jake Torres, who'd been too afraid to skateboard in the cul-de-sac. "Dear Judge Rollins, thank you for making it safe to be a kid here again. I don't know what a federal judge really does, but I know you made the bad guys go away without yelling once. You're cooler than Batman. Jake Torres, Lot 12. She folded the letter gently and placed it in the kitchen drawer with our wedding photos. Outside, the porch light glowed, like a watchful star over Greenwood Hills, learning to breathe again. The wind was gentle that evening, just enough to rustle the curtains we left half-drawn to sway the wind chime Caroline's sister had given us when we moved into Greenwood Hills before the HOA began its slow crawl into every crevice of our peace. Our porch, once the stage of confrontation and intimidation, had become something else entirely. It was a quiet monument, not to anger, not to revenge, but to resolve, to the quiet kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. We sat there almost every evening now. Not because the view was spectacular, it wasn't. It was a modest cul-de-sac, trimmed lawns, brick homes, the occasional barking dog. But it was ours, and it was free. Caroline brought out the tea, her ritual, along with the folded letter from Jake Torres. She smiled as she slid it back into the drawer on the porch table beside her latest crossword and a paperback she barely had time to finish. Greenwood Hills had changed. Without the looming presence of the HOA's abusive board, people had started acting like neighbors again. Marvin Ochoa now ran the neighborhood watch unarmed voluntary and focused on helping elderly residents with groceries or ensuring kids got home safe after dusk. A guy 2 doors down built a take a book, leave a book little library and filled it with mysteries and gardening books. Someone else restored the old community bench near the tennis court, replacing its rusted bolts with care, not obligation. And sunflowers bloomed. They were everywhere. Not just in Mrs. Elena Petrov's yard, but along fences, in pots on porches, even painted on sidewalks in chalk by kids who now roamed free again. It had become a quiet rebellion, a symbol of resistance wrapped in joy. One Sunday morning, our new Greenwood Hills HOA newsletter came 2 pages friendly, typed in a large font with clear headings. No veiled threats, no bolded fines, just news: upcoming potluck lawn care tips for drought season, a poem submitted by a 3rd grader about their dog named Marshmallow. It was almost funny. The weaponized HOA of the past had wielded newsletters like clubs. Now it was a bulletin board of kindness. There were moments when I thought back to that day. The black vests, the boots on our porch, the knock that shook my bones. I remembered the smirk of Victor Hayes and how he flinched when Caroline stepped forward. Not with rage, not with insult, but with truth. That truth had done more damage to their charade than any weapon ever could. A week ago, one of the federal cases wrapped up. George Hammond was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and conspiracy to intimidate. Victor Hayes and Carl Reed received lesser sentences, community service, or bans from holding HOA office in the future. But the most lasting judgment wasn't legal. It was social. Greenwood Hills had remembered its spine, its soul. Caroline declined all interview requests. News vans parked at the neighborhood entrance for days, hoping to catch a comment. But she refused. Let the neighborhood tell the story, she said. It's theirs now. One night around dusk, a young couple we hadn't met before strolled past the porch. The woman smiled and waved, hesitating just enough to ask, "Is this the house where it happened?" I nodded slowly. "It's where it ended." Her husband looked at the porch. "Well, thanks. It's nice here now." After they passed, I turned to Caroline. "We're legends now, huh?" She chuckled. "Retired legends." I reached over and took her hand. "What made you do it that morning? Step out." She leaned her head back and looked at the ceiling like the answer was written in the wood. "Because no one should be afraid on their own porch," she said simply. "And because someone had to remind them. The law isn't a weapon, it's a promise. A promise. That was the word." The porch was ours again. The peace was fragile but real. And every evening we sat beneath that soft porch light, watching the sunset over a street that had once forgotten itself. We were reminded that justice doesn't always come with sirens. Sometimes it comes with silence, with chairs that rock in rhythm, with neighbors who smile without fear, with a front porch that is finally unmistakably home.